Yeah, we've heard about the war on poverty, and we've heard about the war on this and the war on that, the war on terror for years. What about the war on Christians? War on Christians? Is there a war on Christians? Well, sometimes you get the impression from mainstream networks that there isn't. That every one of these massacres is just kind of an isolated incident, having no real connection to each other. But what about when hundreds of Christians get killed in a given weekend? Oh, that's just the Middle East. Lee Habib, his heritage, for those of you who have been listening to yours truly for the last few years, you know that his heritage is Lebanese. And you know he's a Christian. And he writes for the National Review, also runs a great radio network in the U.S. I'm waiting, he writes. I'm a Lebanese Christian, and I'm waiting. I'm waiting for CNN. I'm waiting for MSNBC, ABC, CBS, the New York Times, the LA Times, Time magazine to tell the story, to finally run this headline, War on Christians being waged by Islamists. I'm waiting for someone in the mainstream media to admit the facts. Lee Habib, before we do anything else, you're a very sharp pundit. Will you be waiting until hell freezes over?
You know, I don't know. I mean, if Christians were to ever get their act together and put pressure on some of these networks, not only to report this story, but to, in the end, get together and act and send refugee crisis money over there and bring folks over here. I mean, in the end, it's just like with conservatives, Charles. I mean, I can blame liberals and the media all day long, but in the end, it's on us to do the right things and pressure them into covering these stories. Let me tell you, 70% of Americans are Christians or self-identify. If a quarter of us sent emails to CNN, they'd be covering this story because that will be the story if they didn't.
Would their pushback, just asking here, Lee Habib, would their pushback be, well, wait a minute, the incidents, and they'll call them incidents, of course, the incidents that you're referring to in your column, whether they're happening in Pakistan, Iraq, Kenya, or elsewhere, we're covering all of them. What's your problem, Habib?
Well, that's the thing. They're really not covering, and they're covering them for 1 second, sticking with A15 of the newspaper, and then leaving them alone. And what they're not doing is putting together the giant narrative. Why are half of the 1.5 million Iraqi Christians not in Iraq anymore? 750,000. The UN puts it at 5. But some Christian groups I know put it at half. Nina Shea's great at this over at the Freedom House at the Hudson Institute. And they're going to Lebanon and living in these camps. They're subsisting on essentially porridge. And this is not written about. I can promise you this, Charles. If 600,000 Muslims had been driven out of places where they peaceably lived because Christians had blown up some mosques all around the world, I think that would be a story on CNN.
Now, why would Muslims, because it's not as if people have this feeling that Muslims own CBS and NBC and ABC and the New York Times. It's not as if people feel that 90% of the people working there, on the air, off the air, are Muslims. Why would Muslims have this much power over the networks if they don't own them and very few work there?
Well, I think that's a great question, Charles, and I think that cuts to the core of multiculturalism, of wanting to treat all religions the same. And by the way, this column was not about Islam. It was about Islamists and Islamism, which is a read of Islam that is poisoning the rest of Islam. And I believe that the major networks, A, have a predisposition to really not being crazy about Christians, B, and don't cover them very well, and generally like to cover them when there's like some crazy Baptist minister who has no church and no followers threatening to burn a Koran. They'll cover that fake pastor and that fake story, which then creates an incredible, terrible real story. Meanwhile, this real story is right under their nose, and they're not covering it. Now, why did they cover that pastor story? Because it was offensive to Muslims. Well, let me tell you, it shouldn't be offensive to Muslims, free speech. But what should be offensive to Muslims and Christians and news bureaus is Christians being beheaded, shot, executed, and driven from their homes en masse.
Correct me if I'm wrong on this, but didn't we have a significant general Didn't we have the guy, and he was driven out for personal reasons, the emails and what have you. Didn't we have one of the most famous generals in recent history, the author of the surge himself in Iraq? Didn't he personally contact that particular pastor in Florida, begging him not to burn the Quran?
Yes.
So Petraeus did that. It's not just, I wasn't just dreaming about that. Mr. Petraeus actually did that.
Yes.
How did you feel as an American when this four-star general who is the head of the American forces in the Middle East called the pastor in Florida the nut bar with the Korans?
Well, this tells you everything you need to know about how even some of our greatest minds and some of our great heroes, and I consider, despite that move by Petraeus, much of the work he did heroic during the Iraq War. And it gets you into this mindset. We've got to be careful. We can't offend them. Remember, we elected President Obama in 2008, and we were promised that he would make these great speeches in Turkey and in the Middle East, and the world would be better. He has a middle name called Hussein, and they'll understand him, and he'll understand them, and none of it's worked. And I don't think they want to admit that it doesn't work. I don't think they want to admit, maybe, that the folks like me were right and they were wrong, that there's a small contingency, but small as a percentage, that is actually a very large number when you aggregate them, that simply want to bring the Islamic world back to the 15th century and want to kill everything in its path.
Let me take something right out of your column, and part of it came from Reuters. Lee Habib, in the National Review, you wrote, this one is from Reuters this past weekend. Suicide bombers kill 78 Christians outside Pakistani church. Nearly 600 people had gone to one of Pakistan's most historic churches on Sunday, that's what Christians do, to do what they've been doing for 130 years there, worship their God. A plaque on the wall had this inscription: "This church is erected to the glory of God, dedicated to the memory of all saints, in the year of our Lord Jesus Christ, 1883. Words that don't warm the heart of your average Islamist. The attack occurred as worshippers left the service to receive free food being distributed on a lawn outside the church. That's when the two explosions ripped through the crowd. That was no accident." Lee Habib, are you charging mainstream media with covering this as if it was just another car accident?
Well, look, that was a deliberate choice at a deliberate church. That was one of the oldest churches in Pakistan. At a deliberate time when they knew 600 people were eating, not when they weren't there, no, when they were there. And why that time? To desecrate a holy place, Charles, to desecrate a holy ritual. That food was the result of missionaries and charities. That's the beautiful thing about being a Christian, is the way we tithe and give to each other. And I'll tell you what else wasn't an accident, Charles. These Islamists wanted to let Christians everywhere know there is no place they're safe, not even a sacred house of worship.
Only days before then, Christians fled Syrian village that speaks the language of Jesus, that is Aramaic. It's a very, very old, it's one of the oldest Christian towns in the world, and it's called Malula. I hope I've got the right pronunciation. Christians started fleeing after regime forces failed to win Malula back from the Islamists. We'll never know how many people were killed there. But the essential message from Islamists is, Lee Habib, Christians get out of the Middle East, and at some point, I guess, Christians get out of wherever you live, anywhere in the world.
Yeah, it goes like this, Charles. It goes like this: convert or move or else. It's that simple. It's like the mafia, except worse and more inspired by some divine principality. Because let me tell you, Dennis Prager, one of my colleagues at Salem, wrote a remarkable column the other day about how every imam in all of Islam should be letting every person who does something like this know that they're going to hell. That somehow some of these folks who do things like this actually think they're going to get rewarded for what they do. And I mean spiritually rewarded. And that is something that can't stand and shouldn't stand. So you'll get your periodic denouncement from imams and folks from Islam, but there needs to be a blanket moratorium on the idea that anyone can talk about getting to heaven or being rewarded spiritually from conduct like this.
Let me ask you about fear, because I think that there is a genuine fear, and you allude to it in your column, a fear that many mainstream media have of a lobbyist organization for Muslims funded by certain folks in the Middle East. It's called CAIR, C-A-I-R. Tell us what you know about CAIR.
Well, what I know about CAIR is what I think a lot of us know, which is that they represent themselves as standing up for the rights of Islam and trying to protect Islam from smears and propaganda from folks like me who don't have a problem with Islam. I have a problem with Islamists. And CAIR doesn't seem to have a problem with Islamists. So there's a denunciation here and there from CAIR. We deplore this, but Lee Habib is not allowed to comment about this. That's essentially what they say. And then when we ask CAIR where they get their funding, when we ask CAIR why they're not leading massive press junkets with hundreds of imams at a time to denounce this stuff, to go into these villages and find out who these bad guys are and have them executed for the execution of innocent Christians. There's none of this from CAIR. So that's my problem with CAIR. They're all about, they're a lot like what Al Sharpton and Jesse Jackson do. They're all about retribution, but they're not about accountability to their own people.
So when you say that the media fears them, do they physically fear them, or do they just fear the denunciations? I
think at this point, I don't think that Anderson Cooper would worry that he'd become Theo Van Gogh. Though I have to tell you, I shouldn't say that so ribaldly, because I could be wrong there. Because Theo Van Gogh did pay a heck of a price for what he believed and what he thought. So did Danny Pearl, and so did many Western journalists. And we know that Salman Rushdie's masterpiece that came out recently about his exile and what it did to him, what it did to him psychologically, and what it did to his life and his family and his spiritual life is remarkable. As you remember, Salman Rushdie wrote Satanic Verses at the time at the embassy, right after the embassy had been taken over, and he had cast some, not even necessarily aspersions on Islam, but just a description of a particular scene, and he was living in hiding for years.
But you're suggesting that some members of the mainstream media are literally afraid for their lives to discuss your headline, Islamist War on Christians.
I think they might be. I also think they're afraid of the fallout. I also think they're afraid of, admitting maybe that I'm right and they're wrong. I think they're afraid of admitting that Christians might be victims somewhere and that they should cover them even though they don't really like Christians that much. I think there's a lot they're afraid of wrapped into one thing, Charles, and here's the biggest one. They're afraid that their narrative of multiculturalism is the problem, not the solution.
Lee Habib, thank you.
You bet, Charles.
Lee Habib visiting us from the National Review.